The chest was found on the third day of clearing the estate. For 27 years it had sat in the corner of the Duke's private study, pushed behind a velvet curtain that no servant was permitted to touch. The wood was dark oak, banded with iron that had rusted into the grain, and the lock, a simple brass mechanism, had been forced open with a crowbar by the solicitor who discovered it. Inside, stacked in neat rows bound with silk ribbon, were 52 letters, all addressed to the same woman, all stamped with the seal of the Ashford crest, all never sent. The solicitor read the first one aloud to the empty room, and his hands trembled as he spoke. "I write this at midnight. The servants are asleep. The wedding is in 12 hours, and I am writing to a woman I will never see again because I am too much of a coward to stop it." Her name was Clara. She had worked in the kitchen since she was 14 years old. She had been invisible to everyone except him, and on the night before his marriage to Lady Margaret Ashworth, the daughter of a viscount, the woman society had chosen for him, he had ruined her. Not in the way the servants whispered, not in the way the gossips would later claim. He ruined her by letting her love him, by letting her believe, for one single night in the garden behind the east wing, that a duke could love a kitchen maid. He held her face in his hands. He told her she was beautiful. He promised her that he would find a way. And the next morning, with the sun rising over the estate that would never be hers, he sent her away with gold in her pocket and a letter he had written but could not deliver. The letter was the first one in the chest. "I told you to leave before the ceremony. I told you that I would follow. I told you that I would find you after the wedding, when the chaos settled, when the guests departed, when I could breathe. I lied. I knew I was lying when I said it. I watched your carriage disappear into the fog, and I felt something inside me break that I have never been able to repair. I have spent the last 20 years pretending that I do not love you, and I have failed every single day." Clara left Ashford Manor in a carriage borrowed from a distant cousin. She had a small bag with a few dresses, a pair of boots that did not fit properly, and a child growing inside her that she had not yet told him about. She had planned to tell him in the garden. She had planned to give him the news as a gift, something precious, something that would make him choose her. But when she reached the garden that night, she found him standing beneath the wisteria with his head bowed, and before she could speak, he said the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "I am marrying Lady Margaret in the morning. I have no choice. My father's debts are tied to her dowry. If I do not go through with it, the estate collapses. My mother loses everything. My sisters lose their prospects. Please understand. Please forgive me." She had nodded. She had smiled through the tears she refused to let him see. She had kissed him one last time, softly, the way a woman kisses a man she knows she will never touch again. And then she had walked away, her hand pressed to her stomach, telling herself that the child inside her would never know the name Ashford. The second letter in the chest was dated 3 months after the wedding. "I searched for you. I told Margaret I needed to inspect the northern properties. I rode through every village between here and the coast, asking at every inn, every market, every church. I described your face to strangers who looked at me as though I had lost my mind. Perhaps I had. I found a woman in a village near the border who resembled you, the same dark hair, the same way of tilting her head when she smiled, and I stood outside her cottage for 2 hours before I realized she was not you. I have never felt such emptiness. I have never known that a human being could feel so much absence and continue to breathe." The northern villages were cold that winter. Clara had found work in a textile mill, her fingers raw and bleeding by the end of each day, her body growing weaker as the baby grew stronger. She had changed her name to Mary. She had stopped wearing her hair the way he remembered. She had become invisible again, this time by choice, because being visible meant being found, and being found meant facing the truth she was not ready to accept, that he had not searched for her at all. But he had. And the letters proved it. The third letter, written a year later, was the most desperate. "I have offered a reward, £1,000 to anyone who can tell me where you are. The servants whisper that I have gone mad. Margaret has stopped speaking to me except to ask about the estate accounts. My father is dead. My mother has retreated to the country house. I am alone in a manor that has 70 rooms, and I cannot bear to walk past the garden where I last saw your face. I have planted roses there, a dozen of them, white, the color you wore that night. They do not bloom, they die every season, and I replant them, and I tell myself that if they survive, you will come back. They have not survived. You have not come back." Clara did not know about the roses. She did not know about the reward. She lived in a boarding house with 3 other women. She worked 16-hour days. She gave birth in a charity ward, wrapped the child in a blanket she had knitted herself, and named him Thomas. He had his father's eyes, the same deep grey that turned nearly black in the candlelight. She looked at him every night before she slept, and she whispered the story she would never tell him. Your father is a duke. Your father is a man who chose a dowry over a heartbeat. The fourth letter was shorter. I have stopped searching, not because I have given up, but because I have accepted that you do not want to be found. If you wanted me, you would have come back. If you loved me, you would have written. You have not. So I will stop tearing myself apart over a woman who has chosen to be dead to me. I will remain Asher Ashford, the duke of this trapped estate, married to a woman I respect but do not love, living a life that looks perfect to the world and feels hollow to me. I will write to you less often. I will burn these letters one day, but not yet, not yet. He did not burn them, he kept them all, and he wrote more. The fifth letter, dated nearly 3 years later, was different. The ink was smudged, the handwriting was less controlled. I have done something unforgivable. I have not touched Margaret in 2 years. I have not wanted to. She confronted me tonight. She asked me why I sleep in the study. She asked me if there is another woman. I told her no. I told her that I simply do not love her. The silence that followed was the worst sound I have ever heard. She began to cry. Not with anger, with grief. She said, I have given you everything, and you have given me nothing. She is right. I have given her nothing because everything I have, everything I am, belongs to a woman I threw away. I do not know who I have become, Clara. I do not recognize the man in the mirror. The years passed. Clara saved money. She bought a small cottage near the sea with a garden where Thomas could run. She found work as a seamstress, her hands gentler now, her face weathered but still beautiful. She did not age badly. She aged quietly, like a painting left in the shade. Men looked at her sometimes. She never looked back. Once a month, a letter arrived at the boarding house where she had once lived, redirected by a landlady who had been instructed to burn them. But the landlady, merciful woman that she was, could not bring herself to do it. She kept them in a tin box under her bed, waiting for the day Clara would return to collect them. The sixth letter was the one that changed everything. I have found you. Clara was hanging laundry in the garden when she saw the carriage. It was black, unmarked, pulled by 2 horses she recognized immediately, the Ashford Greys, bred for their strength and their distinctive silver manes. Her body went cold. Her hands stopped moving. She watched the carriage approach and she felt the years collapse into seconds. She was not the kitchen maid anymore. She was not the woman who had wept in the garden. She was a mother. She was a survivor. And she had no intention of breaking again. Asher stepped out of the carriage and she barely recognized him. His face was thinner. There was grey at his temples. His eyes, those grey eyes that Thomas had inherited, were hollow in a way that told her he had not slept well in years. He wore no coat. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and his hands were stained with ink, as though he had been writing when the news came. He did not speak. He simply stood there, looking at her, looking at the cottage behind her, looking at the small boy who had run inside when the horses appeared. And then he fell to his knees on the gravel path. Clara. She did not move closer. She did not soften. She stood with the laundry basket at her hip, her face calm, her spine straight, and she said the words she had rehearsed in her mind every night for the last 7 years. You waited 7 years. I know. You married another woman. I know. 7 years, a lifetime of silence. And now, he kneels. The Duke, who once commanded ballrooms, and broke her heart with a single sentence. That moment, that word I know, carries the weight of every mistake he ever made. If this story already has you gripping the edge of, you sent me away with gold and told me to forget you. I know. And now you come here, to my home, to the life I built without you, and you kneel. I kneel because I do not deserve to stand. I kneel because I have spent every day of every year searching for the right words, and I have failed. I kneel because I am not here to take you back. I am not here to demand anything. I am here to tell you the truth, the one truth I have never spoken aloud. She waited. He looked up at her, and his voice cracked. I did not choose her. I chose debt. I chose survival. I chose the version of myself that my father raised me to be. But that man is dead. That man died the night you walked away. I have spent the last 7 years trying to resurrect him, and I have failed. Because the only version of me that was ever real was the one who loved you in the garden, and you are the only woman who has ever seen him. She turned away, not because she was unmoved, but because she felt something stirring inside her that she had buried so deep she had forgotten it existed. She walked to the cottage door. She opened it. Thomas was standing just inside, his grey eyes wide. his small hands gripping the edge of the table. "Who is that man, Mama?" She looked at her son. She looked at the Duke still kneeling on the gravel, his hands now pressed to the ground, his head bowed, and she closed the door. The 7th letter was written that night, in the cottage's only candle-lit room, on paper Clara found tucked inside her sewing kit. She had never written to him before. She had never allowed herself the luxury of hope. But this night, with Thomas asleep in the next room, with the carriage still visible through the window, she sat down and wrote. "Asher, you found me. But finding me does not mean you know me. You do not know the labor I endured alone. You do not know the nights I held a feverish child and begged God to let him live, because I could not bear to lose the only piece of you I had left. You do not know the years I spent invisible, not because I was hiding, but because I had become someone else entirely, someone who does not need you, someone who built a life from nothing. You kneel in the gravel, and I see the pain in your eyes, and I feel something for you that I have not allowed myself to feel since the garden. But I need you to understand something. I am not the woman you left. I am not the woman who would wait. I am the woman who survived you, and surviving you is the hardest thing I have ever done." She did not give him the letter. She placed it in her own chest, the one she had carried from the mill to the boarding house to this cottage by the sea. She closed the lid. She returned to the window. He was still there, kneeling, his silhouette dark against the moonlight. The next morning he was gone. The gravel path was undisturbed. The cottage gate was unlatched, and on the step outside her door there was a single white rose, its petals still wet with dew. She picked it up. She brought it inside. She placed it beside the chest that held the letter she would never send, and she said nothing. The 8th letter, found in the study 20 years later, was dated the same week. "I returned to Ashford Manor the night after I found you. I did not sleep. I walked through the garden, past the roses that have still not bloomed, and I understood something I had never allowed myself to accept. I lost you the moment I chose the title over you, but I did not lose my son. I did not lose the child who has my eyes, who looked at me from behind your door with the same confusion I have felt my entire life. I will not take him from you. I will not fight for custody. I will not use my name, my wealth, my influence to steal what you built. But I will wait. I will wait for the day when Thomas asks who I am. I will wait for the day when you decide that I have earned the right to stand beside you. And if that day never comes, I will still have written these letters. I will still have loved you. I will still have remained in the only way I know how yours." The chest was loaded onto a cart and transported to the county archives. The solicitor sealed it, stamped it with the Ashford crest, and catalogued it as property of the estate. Years passed. The letters were read by historians, by academics, by curious descendants who wanted to understand the great scandal of the Ashford line. But the woman who received them never returned to claim them. Clara lived to be 74 years old. She never married. She never left the cottage by the sea. Thomas grew tall, became a carpenter, married a girl from the village, and gave Clara 3 grandchildren who filled her home with laughter. He asked about his father only once when he was 16, and Clara told him the truth without bitterness. "Your father was a duke. He loved me the best he could. But the world does not allow dukes to love kitchen maids without consequence. And the consequence, my darling, was you, the best part of him." Thomas never pressed further. But on the day of Clara's funeral, a carriage arrived at the village church, the Ashford Greys, the same silver mains. An elderly woman stepped out, dressed in widow's black, her face lined with grief that had nothing to do with the death of a stranger. She introduced herself as Margaret Ashford, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford. She walked to the front of the church. She knelt before Clara's coffin, and when the congregation stared in silence, she placed a single white rose on the wood. "I spent 40 years married to a man who loved someone else," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He never spoke her name, but he wrote her letters every week of his life. When he died, I found them, all of them, the ones in the chest, and the ones he kept beneath his pillow. He never sent a single one, but he believed, until his last breath, that she would come back." She turned to face Thomas, who sat in the front row with his wife and children. "He asked me to give you this." She handed him a letter. The envelope was yellowed, the seal intact, the handwriting unmistakably Ashford. Thomas opened it. The letter inside was dated the week before his father's death. "Thomas, I have never met you. I have never held you. I have never called you son. But I have loved you since the night I saw you through a cottage door, standing at the edge of a table looking at me with eyes that I have seen in my own reflection every day of my life. I did not write to you while your mother was alive because I knew my presence would have stolen something from her. The peace she earned, the life she built, the dignity she carried without me. But I am writing now because I am dying, and dying has made me brave. I am sorry that I was not the father you deserved. I am sorry that I was not the man your mother deserved, but I am not sorry that you exist. You are the one perfect thing I left behind, and if there is a life after this one, I will spend it trying to be worthy of you. Thomas folded the letter. He placed it in his pocket. He walked to the coffin, placed his hand on the wood, and whispered something that no one else heard. Margaret Ashford left the church without another word. She returned to Ashford Manor, which had been sold to a distant cousin, and she spent her remaining years in a smaller house on the estate, tending to a garden of white roses that refused to bloom. But in the spring of that year, a miracle happened. The roses in the garden, the ones Asher had planted after Clara left, the ones that had died every season for 40 years, burst into bloom. Not white, not the pale, fragile white they had always been. Blood red, deep, vivid, impossible red. The gardeners sent word to the village. People came from miles away to see them. They stood in silent awe, staring at a garden that had defied nature, a garden that had finally spoken. And in the cottage by the sea, where Clara's grandchildren played in the garden, a chest was opened. Inside, beside the letter she had written but never sent, there was a single dried rose, white, pressed between pages of a book she had carried from Ashford Manor 40 years earlier. The book was a collection of poems, the collection his mother had given him as a boy. She had never revealed what she found inside. But the grandchildren never forgot the note that fell out, written in a hand they did not recognize. It said only this: "You were never beneath me. You were the only thing above me. Forever, Asher." The letters are now in a museum, displayed behind glass, catalogued as the Ashford Correspondence. Thousands of people visit every year. They read the words of a man who spent his entire life writing to a woman he could not have. They read the words of a woman who spent her entire life surviving a love that should have been impossible. And they leave wondering, as all great love stories make us wonder, what would have happened if he had been brave enough to send the first letter? The museum curator tells a story. Late at night, when the building is empty and the guards are making their rounds, a young woman sometimes appears in the Ashford exhibit. She is not a ghost, they say. She is a descendant, a granddaughter, great-granddaughter. The name is not recorded. She walks to the glass case. She places her hand on it. She stands there until the guards ask her to leave. She never takes anything. She never leaves anything. But once, on a winter night when the snow fell thick over the city, the guard found a single white rose resting against the glass of the Ashford Correspondence case. There was no note. There was no explanation. The guard placed it in a vase he kept behind his desk. He did not throw it away. He did not ask questions. He understood, without being told, that some letters are never meant to be sent. Some love is meant to remain unwritten. Some stories end not with a reunion, but with a rose that proves, long after both lovers are gone, that something impossible survived. The curator, whose name was Eleanor Vance, had spent 23 years studying the correspondence. She knew every letter by heart. She had written a book about them, a critical analysis that traced the emotional geography of Asher's obsession through the recurring motifs of gardens, roses, and thresholds. She had presented her findings at conferences in London and Edinburgh. She had defended her thesis against scholars who argued that the letters were fabrications, that no duke could have felt such depth for a kitchen maid, that the romance was invented by later generations to sanitize the Ashford legacy. Eleanor knew better. She had spent countless hours with the originals. She had studied the ink density, the paper composition, the handwriting variations that only a true emotional art could produce. The early letters were tight, controlled, aristocratic in their restraint. The middle letters were looser, the letters longer, the pressure of the pen heavier. The final letters were barely legible, the hand of a man who could no longer maintain the performance of composure. But there was one letter that Eleanor had never shown to anyone. It was not in the museum display. It was not catalogued in the archive. It was found years after the initial collection was processed, tucked behind the velvet lining of the chest's false bottom, discovered by a conservator who was restoring the wood for a special exhibition. The conservator, a young woman named Helena, had brought it to Eleanor in a state of visible distress. "I think this was meant to stay hidden," Helena had said. "The seal is different, the paper is heavier, and the date, look at the date." And yet, that hidden letter, the one tucked behind velvet, the one with a woman's seal and a date decades after Asher's death, holds a truth that changes everything Eleanor thought she knew. If you want to be the first to uncover every twist of this forbidden history, subscribe to this channel, because the secrets of the Ashford estate are far from finished. Tell us in the comments, what would you do if you found a letter meant never to be seen? Eleanor had taken the letter with trembling hands. The seal was not the Ashford crest. It was a woman's seal, a small, ornate C intertwined with a rose. The date was 47 years after Asher's death. She had opened it that night alone in her office, with the rain streaming down the windows and the museum empty around her. To whoever finds this, my name is Clara Ashford. The letter was not from Clara. It was from Thomas's daughter, a granddaughter Eleanor had never known existed. She was writing to correct the record. My grandmother, Clara, never told anyone the full truth. She carried it with her to her grave. But I found this letter among her things after she died, hidden in the same chest she had kept for 50 years. It is not addressed to Asher. It is addressed to me. And in it, she tells me a story that changes everything. The letter within the letter, the one Clara had written to her granddaughter, began with a confession. You are old enough now to understand that love is not simple. You are old enough to know that the stories we tell ourselves are often softer than the truth. I have told you that I never wrote to him. I have told you that I never sent a single letter, but that is not entirely true. I wrote one letter, I sent it, and he never received it. Eleanor had read the next paragraph 3 times before she understood what it meant. The night before his wedding to Margaret, I walked to the East Wing. I had the letter in my hand, the one that told him about Thomas. I was going to give it to him. I was going to let him choose. But when I reached the garden, I saw him through the window of his study. He was not alone. Lady Margaret was with him. She was holding his hand. She was crying, and he was comforting her. He was telling her that everything would be fine, that the wedding would be beautiful, that she had nothing to fear. Clara had watched for another minute. She had seen Margaret kiss his cheek. She had seen him smile, a gentle, practiced, aristocratic smile that Clara had never seen him wear. Not once, not in all their months together. And Clara had understood. He was not a prisoner of duty. He was a man who had chosen his life. He had chosen his wife. He was simply too kind, too guilty, too entangled to tell Clara the truth to her face. She had walked back to her room. She had burned the letter in the fireplace. She had packed her bag. And she had left before dawn, not because he had sent her away, but because she could not bear to be the woman who forced him to choose between what he wanted and what he needed. The letter from the false bottom of the chest ended with words that haunted Eleanor for months. I told myself for 50 years that I left because he rejected me. It was easier that way. It made me the victim and him the villain. But the truth is crueler than that. I left because I saw him happy with her. I left because I loved him too much to ruin the life he had built. I left because I knew that my presence would destroy him, and I would rather disappear than become the woman who destroyed the man I loved. Eleanor had closed the letter. She had placed it back in the folder. She had locked it in her desk drawer, and she had never told a living soul what she had read, because the truth, she realized, was not the story anyone wanted to hear. The world wanted the doomed romance. The world wanted the cruel duke and the wronged kitchen maid. The world wanted the letters that were never sent, the love that was never consummated, the tragedy of 2 people kept apart by society and circumstance. But the real tragedy was different. The real tragedy was that Clara had chosen to leave. She had chosen to disappear. She had chosen silence over confrontation, sacrifice over truth. And Asher had spent the rest of his life searching for a woman who had vanished not because she had no choice, but because she had made one. The granddaughter's letter concluded with a request. I am placing this letter where it will be found. I do not know who will read it, but I know that the story of Asher and Clara has become something larger than the 2 people who lived it. It has become a myth, and I think myths deserve the truth, even if the truth is less romantic than the legend. My grandmother was not a victim. She was a woman who made a decision, who lived with its consequences, and who loved a man enough to let him go. That is not a tragedy. That is a choice. And I think she deserves to be remembered for the choice, not for the suffering. Eleanor had considered publishing the letter. She had considered adding it to the exhibit, correcting the record, changing the way the world understood the Ashford correspondence. But something stopped her. Something about the granddaughter's words, about the myth being larger than the truth, made her hesitate. She was still hesitating when the winter night came, and the rose appeared against the glass, and the guard placed it in a vase behind his desk. Eleanor watched the security footage the next morning. She saw a woman approach the case. She saw her place the rose. She saw her stand there for exactly 3 minutes and 14 seconds before turning and walking away. The woman was young. Her face was partially obscured by the hood of her coat, but Eleanor paused the footage at 1:47 when the woman's face was turned slightly toward the camera, and she saw something that made her breath catch. The woman had grey eyes, deep, striking grey eyes that turned nearly black in the low light. The same grey eyes that Thomas had inherited. The same grey eyes that Asher Ashford had seen in his own reflection every day of his life. Eleanor did not call security. She did not report the intrusion. She copied the footage onto a private drive, deleted the original, and spent the rest of the day staring at the photograph she had captured. She did not know the woman's name. She did not know where she lived. But she knew with a certainty that bypassed logic and settled into the marrow of her bones that the Ashford story was not over. Some letters remain unwritten. Some roses bloom against all reason, and some love does not end with death, but with the descendant who carries the weight of a choice made 50 years ago, and who places a rose against the glass because the silence of the grave is not the end of the conversation. The photograph stayed in Eleanor's drawer. The granddaughter's letter stayed in her locked desk, and the Ashford correspondence stayed in its glass case, visited by thousands, read by hundreds, understood by almost no one. But the woman with the grey eyes returned every year on the same night. She left a single white rose. She stood for exactly 3 minutes and 14 seconds, and she left without a word. Eleanor never asked her name, never approached her, never acknowledged that she knew, because some stories she had learned are not meant to be completed. They are meant to be held, like a pressed rose in a book, like a letter never sent, like the weight of a love that was never quite lost, only transformed into something that could survive without being spoken. And on the last night of her career, 23 years after she had first opened the chest, Eleanor Vance walked to the Ashford exhibit for the final time. She placed her hand on the glass. She closed her eyes, and she whispered the words that Clara had never said aloud. "I chose to leave, but I never stopped loving you." She left the museum that night without looking back. She did not take the photograph. She did not unlock the drawer. She left the granddaughter's letter exactly where it was, hidden in the false bottom of a story that had already become larger than the truth. And in the morning, when the guards made their rounds, they found 2 white roses resting against the Ashford correspondence case. One was already there. The other was fresh, its stem still wet, as though it had been placed only moments before. The guards looked at each other. They said nothing. They placed both roses in the vase behind the desk, and they went on with their day as people do, carrying a mystery they would never solve, in a world that still believed in the kind of love that letters were written for, but which could never fully contain. The guard who found the roses that morning was a man named Arthur Cole. He had worked the night shift at the museum for 11 years, and he had seen things that defied explanation. Shadows that moved without a source, footsteps in empty corridors, the faint sound of breathing in rooms that had been locked for hours. He never spoke of them. He had learned early in his career that the building was alive in ways that the daytime staff would never understand. But the roses were different. The roses were real. He touched them. He felt the cool moisture on the stems. He carried them to his desk and placed them in the vase beside the photograph of his wife, who had died 7 years earlier, whose name he still whispered when he thought no one was listening. Arthur did not tell Eleanor about the second rose. He did not report it in the logbook. He did not mention it to the morning supervisor. He simply accepted it, the way he had accepted the other strange things that occurred in the quiet hours, and he went on with his duties. But that night, as he made his rounds through the darkened galleries, he found himself drawn to the Ashford exhibit. He stood before the glass case, his flashlight off, his breath shallow. The roses were still in the vase at his desk, but he could have sworn in the dim light that filtered through the museum's high windows that he saw the faint outline of a figure standing on the other side of the room. A woman. Young, her face obscured, her hand resting on the wall as though she were steadying herself. Arthur did not call out, he did not approach. He simply waited, his heart beating in his throat until the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but the memory of a presence. He walked back to his desk. He sat down. He stared at the roses for a long time, and he made a decision that he would never explain to anyone. He took one of the roses. He walked to the fire exit at the back of the building. He opened the door. He placed the rose on the ground outside against the wall where the morning sun would find it. And he went back inside, closed the door, and said nothing. The rose remained there for 3 days. A cleaning crew found it. A supervisor threw it away. No one asked questions. But Arthur knew with a certainty that settled into his bones that he had done the right thing. He had returned something that was never meant to be kept. Years later, when the Ashford correspondence was moved to a larger museum in London, Arthur did not attend the farewell ceremony. He did not watch the chest being crated and loaded onto the truck. He stayed in his office filing reports, pretending that he did not care. But that night, when the museum was empty and the exhibit hall was bare, he walked to the spot where the glass case had stood. He knelt down. He pressed his palm to the floor, and he found wedged between 2 floorboards a single white petal. He did not keep it. He did not put it in a frame. He let it fall from his hand, watched it drift to the ground, and walked away. Some things, he understood, are not meant to be preserved. They are meant to be released. The Ashford correspondence arrived in London on a Tuesday morning. The crate was opened in a climate-controlled room. The letters were inspected, catalogued, and prepared for a new exhibition that would draw crowds from across the continent. The curator in London was a man named Dr. Simon Croft, and he had spent the last 4 years studying the collection from afar. He had written 3 papers on the emotional significance of the letters. He had interviewed descendants. He had travelled to the village where Clara had lived, walked the path to her cottage, stood in the garden where she had hung laundry. But he had never seen the letters in person. When he finally held them, his hands trembled. He read the first letter, the one written on the night before the wedding, and he felt the same chill that Eleanor had felt 23 years earlier. He read the second, the search letter, and he felt the desperation pouring off the page. He read the third, the letter about the roses that would not bloom, and he had to set it down and walk away. The collection affected everyone who touched it. The conservators refused to work alone in the room. The interns whispered that they could smell gardenias, even though no flowers were allowed in the archive. The security cameras occasionally captured movement where no movement should have been. Dr. Croft dismissed the rumors. He was a man of science, of evidence, of verifiable fact. He did not believe in ghosts. He did not believe in love that survived the grave. He believed in ink and paper and the historical record. But on the night before the exhibition opened, he decided to stay late. He wanted to be alone with the letters. He wanted to feel the weight of them without the distraction of the staff. He sat at the table. He opened the chest. He removed each letter in order, reading them slowly, letting the words settle into his consciousness. And when he reached the final letter, the one Asher had written on his deathbed, the one addressed to Thomas, he noticed something that he had never seen in any of the photographs. At the bottom of the page, beneath Asher's signature, there was a small indentation. Not ink, not a tear. A pressure mark, as though something had been written on top of the letter while it was still wet. Dr. Croft held the paper to the light. He tilted it at different angles. He used a magnifying glass, and he saw it. A single word, pressed into the paper with such force that the fibers had been permanently compressed. The word was written in a different hand, a woman's hand, the same hand that had written the letter hidden in the false bottom. The word was yes. Dr. Croft sat back in his chair, the letter trembling in his hands. The indentation was barely visible, a ghost of a word, pressed into the paper by a hand that had written something on another sheet placed directly over this one. He had read about such techniques. A writer could press so hard that the words transferred to the page below like a carbon copy without the carbon. It was accidental, almost always, a moment of such intensity that the hand forgot its own strength. He scanned the rest of the letter, searching for other indentations. He found 3 more, 1 near the top, 2 in the middle. He held the paper to the light, closed one eye, and read the faint impressions. The first one, near the top, was a single letter, C. The second, in the middle, was 4 letters in a row. Come. The third, near the bottom, was the longest. Come back. He did not sleep that night. He locked himself in his office, pulled every file on the Ashford correspondence from the archive, and spent the hours until dawn reconstructing the scene. Asher had written the final letter on his deathbed. He had been weak, his hand unsteady, his mind clouded with fever and morphine. He had written the words, sealed the envelope, and handed it to his solicitor with instructions to deliver it to Thomas only after Clara's death. But before he sealed it, someone else had been in the room. Someone had placed a sheet of paper over the letter and written 3 words with such force that they had left permanent marks on the page below. The ink of those words had dried. The paper had been removed, and the secret had been buried for decades. Dr. Croft cross-referenced the medical records from Asher's final illness. The Duke had died at Ashford Manor, attended by his wife Margaret, a physician, and 2 nurses. No one else was listed. No visitors had been recorded in the estate log, but the handwriting on the indentation, the elongated curve of the C, the sharp angle of the M, the flourish on the K, matched the handwriting in the letter found by Eleanor Vance. He drove to the museum the next morning, called Eleanor, and told her what he had found. She listened in silence. When he finished, she said only 2 words. She came. Who? Now we know the words that were hidden beneath Asher's letter, but the name of the hand that wrote them still waits to be uncovered. If you want to see this mystery unravel to its final devastating truth, subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. This story is far from over. Tell me in the comments, who do you believe left that message? Was it Clara herself or someone else who carried her secret? I want to hear your theory, because the next piece of the puzzle, Clara, or someone who knew her, someone who knew what Asher was writing, someone who wanted him to know that the answer was yes. He spent the next month investigating. He traveled to the village by the sea. He found the cottage, now a bed and breakfast, owned by a woman named Rosalind Hart, who claimed to be Clara's great-granddaughter. She had grey eyes, the same deep, haunted grey that had stared out from the museum security footage. She was in her 40s, with silver streaking her dark hair and lines of grief carved into her face. She invited him inside, offered him tea, and listened as he told her about the indentation, the word yes, the 3 phrases buried in the paper. She did not react with surprise. She set down her teacup, folded her hands in her lap, and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of a story told many times. My grandmother never told anyone the full truth, but she told me. On her deathbed, when I was 16 years old, she made me promise I would never repeat it until the letters were made public. She said the world would not understand. Not then. Maybe not ever. What did she tell you? Rosalind looked out the window, toward the sea, where the grey water met the grey sky in a line that was barely visible. She told me that she went to him. On the night he died, she found out through a servant who had been kind to her, a woman who had kept her secret for decades. She travelled from the cottage to Ashford Manor in a hired carriage, arriving after midnight. The servant let her in through the kitchen entrance. She walked up the back stairs to his bedroom. She stood in the doorway, watching him sleep, watching the man who had spent 40 years writing letters he never sent. Did he know she was there? Rosalind nodded slowly. He opened his eyes. He looked at her, and he said her name, not as a question, as a statement, as though he had known all along that she would come. What did she do? She walked to his bedside. She took his hand. She told him that she had received every letter. She told him that she had kept them all, hidden in a chest beneath her bed, read and reread until the paper was soft with her fingers. She told him that she had never stopped loving him, and then she told him the truth she had carried for 47 years. What truth? She told him that she had seen him with Margaret, the night before the wedding. She had gone to deliver the letter telling him about Thomas, but she had seen him holding Margaret's hand, comforting her, smiling in a way that Clara had never seen him smile. She had assumed he had chosen her. She had assumed he was happy. She had left to protect him from the destruction her presence would cause. But he wasn't happy. No, he was never happy. He told her that. On his deathbed, with the morphine wearing off and the pain returning, he told her that the smile she had seen was a performance. He had been comforting Margaret because she had discovered the letter he had written to Clara. Margaret had found it in his study, read it and confronted him. He had spent the entire night convincing her to go through with the wedding anyway. The smile, the one Clara had seen through the window, was a lie. It was the greatest lie he ever told. And it cost him everything. A silence fell between them. Dr. Croft stared at his hands. Rosalind stared at the sea. So she stayed, he said finally. That night, she stayed with him until he died. Yes. And the letter, the one on his deathbed. She wrote something on a separate sheet, placed it over the paper and pressed so hard that the words transferred to the page below. She wrote 3 things. C for Clara. Come. Come back. She was telling him that she had finally returned, that she had always wanted to return, that the answer to every letter he had ever written was yes. Dr. Croft felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. 47 years of separation. 47 years of letters never sent, of love never spoken, of 2 people orbiting each other in silence. And in the final hours of his life, she had come. She had told him the truth. She had freed him. Did he hear her? He asked. He was unconscious by the time she finished writing. The morphine had taken him, but she believed with all her heart that he knew, that somewhere in the space between waking and dying, he felt her hand on his. He felt the words she pressed into the paper. He died with her name on his lips. She heard him say it. Clara. And then he was gone. Dr. Croft did not ask anything else. He did not need to. He understood in that moment what the Ashford correspondence truly was. Not a tragedy of love lost, but a story of love that had never stopped reaching. Across decades, across distance, across the final boundary of death itself. The letters were not the evidence of Asher's obsession. They were the evidence of his faith. A faith that Clara would one day read them, that she would one day understand, that she would one day come. And she had. He left the cottage that evening. He drove back to London with the image of Rosalind's grey eyes burned into his memory. He did not tell anyone about the conversation. He did not add it to the exhibition notes. He did not correct the official record, because some truths, he had learned, are not meant for the public. Some truths are sacred. They are passed from grandmother to granddaughter, whispered in the dark, held close to the heart. They do not belong in glass cases or academic papers. They belong to the people who lived them. The Ashford correspondence remained in the London Museum for another decade. It was studied, analysed, written about, debated. Scholars argued over the meaning of the indentation. Some claimed it was a forgery. Others insisted it was a sign. A few whispered in private conversations that they had felt something in the room where the letters were kept, a presence, a warmth, the faint scent of gardenias. Dr. Croft retired at 62. He moved to a small cottage near the sea, not far from the one where Clara had lived. He grew roses in his garden, white roses mostly, but also red ones because he had learned that love was not a single colour. He visited Rosalind occasionally. They sat on her porch, watching the tide come in, and they talked about the letters. He told her about the scholars, the debates, the theories. She told him stories that Clara had told her, small moments from the years of separation, glimpses of a life lived in parallel to Asher's. She told him about the night Thomas fell ill. Clara had sat by his bedside for 3 days, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat. She had prayed. She had begged God to spare him. And in the darkest hour of the 3rd night, she had taken out the letters. All of them. The ones from Asher and the ones she had written but never sent. She had read them aloud to the empty room. She had let the words fill the space. And she had felt for the first time in years as though someone was holding her hand. She never told anyone that story, Rosalind said. Not even Thomas. But she told me, because she wanted me to know that love does not have to be present to be real. It does not have to be spoken to exist. It can be carried, it can be held. It can survive in the space between two people who never touch again. Dr. Croft died 3 years later. He was found in his garden, seated in a chair facing the sea, a book of poetry open on his lap. The book was the same one that Asher had given Clara, the one with the pressed rose, the one that had been passed down through 3 generations of women. Rosalind found the book. She opened it to the page where the rose had been pressed. The rose was gone, crumbled to dust long ago. But the indentations remained. And written in the margin in Clara's hand were the words that had never been sent. Yes, 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 forever, Clara. The book was donated to the museum. It was placed in the Ashford exhibit, not far from the letters, in a separate case with a plaque that read, "The Ashford correspondence has been studied for generations, but the true story was never in the letters. It was in the spaces between them. It was in the rose that bloomed after 40 years. It was in the word pressed into the paper on a dying man's bedside. It was in a granddaughter's grey eyes, in a curator's silence, in a guard who placed a rose against the glass. The letters remain. They are read by thousands. They inspire books, films, ballets, poems. They are analysed by scholars who argue over their meaning. But the deeper truth, the truth of Clara's return, the truth of the word yes, the truth of a love that survived the grave, is not written in any archive. It is carried in the blood of the women who came after. It is whispered in the sea air of the cottage. It is felt by those who pay attention in the quiet hours of the museum, when the lights are low and the guards are making their rounds. And sometimes on a winter night, when the snow falls thick over the city, a woman with grey eyes walks through the museum. She does not stop at the exhibit. She does not leave a rose. She simply passes through, her footsteps soft, her presence barely noticed. Because she does not need to prove anything. She is the living evidence. She is the story that continues, and some letters, after all, were never meant to end.